All right, hey guys, this is Fred. We're back for another Evidence of God for Skeptics, Session 6, New Testament Reliability. So in this session, a lot of the material is based from a book written to the popular audience, that's us, not the academic community. The book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Dr. Norman Geisler and Dr. Frank Dorick. It's a great read, great book, definitely recommend it. If it's something you want to dive into. There's a couple other books I'll show you at the end if you want to do a deeper dive in some of the materials for tonight. This is a rough outline of what we've been working through. The first 5 sessions were scientific, philosophical evidence for God, and now we're getting into the point where we're now talking about, or getting into the evidence why it's the Christian God, or why do we believe it to be the Bible, and what's the evidence behind that. So let's summarize a little bit the journey so far, sessions 1 through 5, and feel free to go back and watch those videos. The evidence for God so far is the cosmological argument that the universe had a beginning, came from nothing. Even atheist scholars, scientists believe this. So there had to be something to cause it, right? We believe that cause is God. The teleological argument that the universe seems highly fine-tuned for human life, a designer, which we believe to be God, more evidence for God, or that God is the best explanation so far for all these things. Origin of life and evolution, more evidence of a designer, and then we get into the philosophical arguments, the moral argument, and then are miracles possible? We covered that as well in the last session. Right? Based on just that information alone, based on this scientific information alone, the creator of the universe had to be immaterial, right? Because it's not part of our universe. It had to be timeless, because time, space, and matter all came into existence at the same time. So whatever created it had to be timeless and spaceless. Extremely powerful to create this universe. Personal, and that's because there was nothing existed before, and then something had to create something, right? So something had to make a choice, right? So this creator had to make a choice to make something. Extremely intelligent, to design this universe, purposeful, it seems to be designed just for us, and morally perfect. By coincidence, this happens to be the exact characteristics of God as described by biblical Christianity, right? Not looking at a Bible, not reading a Bible, but the characteristics based on the science is the same characteristics we happen to find in the Bible. So the first 5 sessions were proving that we have a theistic God. We live in a universe created by a God, that there is a God. So we've proven, I think, beyond reasonable doubt and through the evidence, that we are in a theistic world, meaning God made all, right? Pantheism religions are belief is that God is everything, that God is the paint in the picture, not the painter, right? Atheism, there's no God at all. So through the science, through beyond the reasonable doubt, right? Pantheism is out, any pantheistic religion, and atheism is obviously out. Right? So that leaves all religions that are non-theistic religions to be not true, but theistic religions to be possibly true. One of the theistic religions to be possibly true: Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. Now it could be that none of these are true, right? But if one of these is, if one religion is true, it's going to be one of these 3. And so now we're going to go into the evidence of the Christianity. Now, the New Testament reliability. 2 things we have to ask. Do we have accurate copies of the original New Testament documents? Right? If you ask a Mormon, and they're going to tell you, no, the Bible's been changed, and we've long lost a translation of the Bible. And do the original New Testament documents tell the truth? Right? Those are the 2 questions that historians try to answer and try to figure out in order to test the reliability of ancient manuscripts. Now, keep in mind, we're not talking about the Bible. We're not talking about the Bible as we know it today, and people argue, oh, you can't use the Bible to back the Bible. We're talking about manuscripts that were written pre-100 AD. Right? We're talking about historical methodology and how historians fact-check the reliability of old documents. It wasn't until hundreds of years later, in the 300s, the 400s, finally settled in the 5th century, that these manuscripts came together and were put under a title called the New Testament, right? So think before that. Before there was a Bible, all we had was manuscripts, and that's what we're talking about. 4 major reasons we know we have an accurate copy of the New Testament. We have earlier manuscripts, we have more manuscripts, more accurately copied manuscripts, and more abundantly supported manuscripts than anything else from the ancient world. And here's some graphs that I'm going to show you. Here's the number of copied manuscripts we have. I'm not sure if how well you can see that. But for example, documents from Caesar, we have 10. From Plato, we have 7. From Herodias, we have 8. From Demosthenes, we have 200. Talked about Alexander the Great. Right? How do we know Alexander the Great lived? Through a very small handful of documents that we have, 200 or so. Homer in the Iliad, 643 documents. New Testament, 5,686 documents, right? And about 5,700 documents. We actually have more than this, but we'll cover that. But 5,700 documents of number of copies we have for the New Testament. Now, what's the time gap? What's the time gap from the first copy we found to when the original was written? Right? So it'd be like if somebody wrote a book about 9/11 back in 2001 and wrote about it today in 2021, and years later they found a copy of whatever I wrote today, right? They would know that, okay, it's based on an original copy that was written X years ago based on an event. So it's kind of what the historians look at. It's like, hey, we have the copy, this is the earliest copy, and when do we think the original was written? So again, Caesar, manuscripts about Caesar, written 1,000 years later from the original. Right, the copy was found, the first copy is 1,000 years past the original. Plato, 1,200 years past the original and the events that happened. Herodias, 1,400. Demosthenes, 1,400. Homer, 500. 1,000 years later, that's plenty of time to introduce legends, to introduce all kinds of maybe alterations possibly. New Testament, 25 years, right? Around 25 years from the original and the events that happened, right? This is, the New Testament is even less now because of the stuff found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Right, so this is the two charts together, right? And we've even discovered a fragment of Mark from the early 1st century that they've found actually over Professor Daniel Wallace, the head of the Center of New Testament Manuscripts. So we're talking about, of all the ancient documents, the New Testament has the most copies, and copies that were within like 25 years of the original versus hundreds and thousands of years later. So we have early copies of manuscript, and we'll dive a little bit more into that. Or we have abundance of copies. It's not even a matter of we don't have enough information. It's almost we have too much information, and we'll talk more about that. So how do we know what the original said? If the original is lost and we don't have the originals, how do we know what the original manuscripts said? So we don't have the original, but we can have all the copies. So we look at copy number 1, and we look at they look at Philippians 4:13. Copy number 1 says, I can do all T, and there's an error, INGS through Christ who gives me strength. Copy 2 says, I can do all TH, error, NGS through Christ who gives me strength. Copy 3, I can do all THI, there's an error, GS through Christ who gives me strength. Copy 4, I can do all THIN, error, S through Christ who gives me strength. Can we not create what the original said? Right? I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. Right? And the thing that kind of blew my mind, right, is this next statement. The New Testament has fewer variations than this example. Right? We know what the original said. Right? The errors, I think it's like, most of the errors are grammar, are like names and grammar, and we'll talk about that. But we have far fewer variations than this. Now, some people like to say, well, if God's so great and God's so powerful, why didn't he just preserve the originals? Right? And Dr. Frank Turk likes to speculate on this, but think about if we had the originals, what we would do with them. We would worship them, we would venerate them, right? When I went to Israel, I see this in the Holy Sepulchre, right? If they think Jesus touched it or laid on it, they pray it, they worship it, it becomes the object and not God. So that's one possible reason. Second, let's say that I gave you my name, my address, and phone number. I had you all write it down. And then every one of you compared your notes, right? There might be some people who wrote it down wrong, And you would recognize through all the abundance of copies that are the same that those are outliers, right? Those are outliers. So what if I had your will? What if you wrote a Last Testament will and you gave me the original copy? What could I do with it? Any guesses? I could forge it. I could change it. I have the original, right? I can change it and make it say different things. But what if you had a copy and 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 you had a copy, right? And then I had the original. I tried to change it, right? You would know that it was changed because all the other copies don't say that, right? So if anything, by getting rid of the original, you actually preserve the original through all the copies because no one can actually change theirs because they're all copies, right? And the minute one is way off, everyone knows that it's wrong because none of the other copies have that information. Diocletion, he was a Roman emperor from 284 to 305. He persecuted the Christians during his reign, and he tried to burn all the manuscripts and burn the Christians. Right? Tried to burn all the evidence and all the manuscripts that they had. And even if he burned them all, let's say he burned all the New Testament manuscripts, he was able to burn them all, which he wasn't. 46% of the 8,000 New Testament verses are found in other manuscripts from the 1st and 2nd century. Over 36,000 quotations from early church fathers, right? So what happened was early church fathers wrote their own manuscript documents, and they referenced the New Testament and quoted from the New Testament. So if you take just the quotations alone from those other documents, we could still recreate 46% of the New Testament, basically half the New Testament. In addition to the 5,700 Greek manuscript copies that we have, there are over 19,000 manuscripts from other languages. Right? In addition to the 57, we have 19,000 manuscripts. If you were to stack all the manuscripts we have in the New Testament, it would stack over a mile high of New Testament data. Right? Compared to classical Greek authors, 4 feet. Right? And you're talking about mile high New Testament manuscripts, 4 feet for other classical historic Greek authors. So again, it's not a matter of we don't have enough information. We have almost too much information, right? Because there's so much data, right? And there's some areas that are questionable, but they're not critical areas, and we'll talk about that. This is Bruce Metzger. He's one of the greatest manuscript experts of the last century. Over at he's at Princeton University. He's a Christian, believes in the Scripture to be true, and this is Bart Ehrman, who studied under Professor Metzger. Bart Ehrman claimed to be a Christian and went to the Princeton University, and studied under Metzger. Bart Ehrman says that he lost his faith and he's a happy agnostic, which Dr. Frank Turk likes to joke around because if you're a scientist, you want to know things, and if you're agnostic, you don't know things. So he just wonders how he can be a happy agnostic scientist. But anyway, Bart Ehrman studied under Bruce Metzger, and he wrote a book called Misquoting Jesus. And he tries to spin the data. If you were to read the book Misquoting Jesus, he tries to spin the data so that when you walk away after reading the book, you have doubts that the New Testament documents can be accurate and even reconstructed. Right? You leave, after reading that book, you kind of leave with that impression. There's some problems with his book from Misquoting Jesus. One, right? How do you know that the original had been altered unless you know what the original said? Right? You have to know. You can't say, "Oh, it could have been altered from the original," unless you know what the original said. So it's kind of an argument that can't stand on its own. Right? You can't misquote something if you don't know what the original was. Second, about 80% of the variants, because he says, "Oh, there's 200,000 variants that are different across the copies." 80% of them are spelling issues, right? No change in meaning at all. For example, they'll use Christ Jesus or Jesus the Christ, right? Or they'll use different spellings or references to Peter, for example. They'll say Peter or Caiaphas, which means Peter, or they'll say Simon Peter and Peter. So it's a grammatical thing, right? It's a name variant. It's not that actually changes any meaning of the verse. Only 1% of these variants affect any meaning, and none of them affect significant Christian doctrine. Right? None of them affect Christian doctrine. Only 1% actually affect any type of meaning. And what's interesting, Ehrman doesn't even agree with himself. One, he was on a radio show once, and a caller called in and said, what do you think the New Testament said? And his response was pretty much what we have now, right? It's like, why'd you write this book then, right? Second, right, in 2005, right, why did he write this book? And Dr. Frank Turk has some speculation about that, but let's look at the year he wrote it. In 2005, Bart Ehrman writes Misquoting Jesus to the popular audience. Popular audience is us, regular layman's, non-academic community. And he says in his book, we're not sure the New Testament is accurate, right? That's what he says in his book to the masses. Then that same year, he wrote another book with his mentor, Bruce Metzger, right? Updating one of Bruce Metzger's older books. They both worked on it together, and they both came to the same conclusion, that we do know what the New Testament documents originally said, and the current New Testament is an accurate copy of the original. That was the conclusion from the second book he wrote with his mentor. So he writes, so think about this, he writes, and that was to the academic community. He writes one book to the masses that says, we're not sure the New Testament is accurate. And then he writes one book to the academic world that says, oh, we know it's accurate and we do have an original copy. And if you think about that, if he was to write that in his popular book to the popular audience, it wouldn't sell anything. No one buys, oh, the Bible's true, like no one buys that book. But if you say, oh, the New Testament might be inaccurate, then, you get book sales, right? So the speculation is he did it for book sales because he can't tell the academic community it's not accurate because they would call him out on it, they would dig into it, and they would peer review that, right? So that's peer reviewed, the academic one, so he has to sell the truth. And to the rest of us, he can say whatever he wants because it's not an academic book. Then to make it even worse, right, he quotes, this is from his book, Misquoting Jesus, right? He actually writes this in the same book where he says he's not sure. Bruce Metzger is one of the great scholars of modern times, and I dedicated the book to him because he was both my inspiration for going into me in the field. I have nothing but respect and admiration for him, and even though we may disagree on important religious questions, he's a firmly committed Christian, I am not, we are in complete agreement on a number of very important historical and textual questions. If he and I were put in a room and asked to hammer out a consensus statement on what we think the original text of the New Testament probably looked like, there would be very few points of disagreement. Maybe 1 or 2 dozen places out of many thousands. I argue for in Misquoting Jesus does not actually stand at odds with Professor Metzger's position that the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript edition of the New Testament. So basically he's saying, even though what I said in the book, it might not be true, but I don't disagree with Metzger, who says it is true, and I think it's true too, and it doesn't affect Christian faith and doctrine in any way, right? It's an obvious, I'm trying to sell books, book, right? Let's look at the accuracy percentage, right? The Mahabharata of the Hinduism is copied at a 90% accuracy. Homer's Iliad is copied at about a 95% accuracy. The New Testament is at about a 99.5% accuracy, with the 0.5 not affecting a single doctrine of Christian faith. Right? We do know what the original says. We do have an accurate copy of the original. Right? If you want to go look at even the manuscripts themselves, there's a great site here, the Center for New Study of New Testament Manuscripts, csntm.org. You can actually go on there. What they've been doing is trying to digitize all the manuscripts across the world. Right? And so all the manuscripts you're trying to get from the museums and everywhere, digitize them, put it in an online library. You can actually go on there and pick what century you want, pick what books of the Bible you want, and you can actually look at the original manuscripts, which is pretty amazing. Sir Frederick Kenyon, a former director of the British Museum, says, it cannot be too strongly asserted that in substance the text of the Bible is certain, especially in the case of the New Testament. The number of manuscripts of the New Testament, of early translations from it, and the quotations from it in the oldest writers of the church is so large that it is practically certain that the true reading of every doubtful passage is preserved in some one or other of these authorities, ancient authorities. This can be said of no other ancient book in the world. All right, so do we have an accurate copy of the original New Testament documents? Answer is yes. And if anyone states otherwise, they've done zero research into it. Right? They're just touting rhetoric that they just heard from before. Right? And it's generally a settled question. If you ask any true historian scholarship, even secular, they agree with this statement that it is an accurate copy of the New Testament documents, right? So that's question one, which I think we've kind of cleared that one up. Number two, do the original Testament documents tell the truth? Great, we have an original copy, but how do we know they're even truthful? Right, so some objections first. Let's talk about some of the objections. Some recent objections, a recent one coming up is that history can't be known. Right? Recent arguments are history can't be known. What's interesting, the people that argue that history can't be known are the same people who, beyond a doubt, say life originated from non-living chemicals. They know that for sure, but even though we have eyewitness testimony and people from the time of Jesus and the resurrection, well, that can't really be known. But millions of years ago, that can be known with no science or no evidence behind it, which is kind of ironic, I think. How do we know George Washington existed? How do we know Abe Lincoln was the 16th president? How do we know Pearl Harbor and the Holocaust happened? Right? The objection is just plain wrong. Right? If we don't know history, then we couldn't detect revisionism. Even now, people try to say, "Oh, the Holocaust didn't really exist," right? But we know it did. We have the evidence. We have all the information from that. We know it happened in history. Now, what we could argue is what does to know mean? Right? To know something mean? Right? And this is where you weren't there, so you don't know beyond with factual information. And you're right. We talked about this when we talked about truth, but everything's probability, right? To know something, we can't go back in time and witness the events. You have to use forensic science. You have to look at the evidence just as a jury would in a courtroom and come to a conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt. To know history, right, like in a courtroom, it's probabilities. It is to determine something beyond a reasonable doubt. If history cannot be known, then no jury could ever reach a verdict, right? To assert that something is not true, you can't say, well, the resurrection didn't really, unless you know what actually happened, right? So just even asserting something's not true is not valid to say it didn't happen, unless you can say what really did happen, right? So to know something, right, obviously we can know history, and we're talking about beyond a reasonable doubt of probabilities based on the evidence we have. Another objection is the New Testament documents contain miracles. We won't dive into this. We talked about this in the last session. We know miracles are possible. If we prove scientifically, this is a theistic world, meaning that God created the universe. The greatest, anyone remember what's the greatest miracle? Anyone remember? The creation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. If that's true, and we show science for God creating the universe, him turning water into wine, you think you can't do that? Can't resurrect somebody, can't do all the other miracles that are in there, right? So we talked about that already last time. And in addition, the miracles in the New Testament were predicted, which strengthens their historicity, right? Because they were actually predicted ahead of time. Another objection, the New Testament writers were biased, right? There was even I don't know, it was Discovery or History Channel, one of them were doing a study on the New Testament, and they said, well, we can't really take the word of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John because they were converted, right? And so they were meaning that they were biased, and because of that, they lie, right? Conversion doesn't mean they lied and exaggerated. If anything, they have to be more accurate. But the question to ask is, why were they converted? Other than Luke, you're talking about Jewish men, right? Other than Luke, they already had the one true religion. They already believed they had the one true religion, right? They abandoned 2,000 years of religion and culture. They abandoned their livelihoods. They abandoned their traditions. They gained no power. They were tortured to death because of their beliefs. They had every motive to deny the resurrection, yet they proclaim it. Right? So that should be the question, is why were these people converted in the first place? But no, they were converted so as if their word had no weight. On top of that is, then converted people are not objective. And that's just silly as well. A doctor can give an objective diagnosis for a loved one or someone he has strong feelings for. Right? He can be objective even if he's not neutral. Any book written by any author believes what they're writing. That doesn't mean they're not objective. Right? So there are weak objectives, weak arguments against the truth of the New Testament. So how do we determine what do we look at to see if the New Testament is true? Early testimony, eyewitness testimony, embarrassing testimony, excruciating testimony, and extra biblical testimony. Right? These are the 6 points. Tonight, we're going to go through point 1 and point 2, and then in the next section, we'll go through the other points. So this is kind of a part 1 of part 2. So let's talk about early books. How do we know the books were written early? All New Testament books were written before 100 AD, 70 years after the death of Jesus. Right? How do we know this? Because they are referenced and cited in other books found to be written in 95, 107, and 110 AD. Right? They're referenced and cited in books written in those years that they can show. You have a book in 95 from Clement from Rome, and you have a book in 107 and 110 in Asia Minor. Right? And they didn't have email back then. They had to put that copy walk it across the planet on a boat, right, across the continent, right? It took time to circulate these documents. So they were written even before that in order for the documents to get around. Most, maybe all, New Testament books were written before 70 AD, 40 years after the death of Jesus. So how do we know this? So imagine that someone's writing a book about the World Trade Center, and they're telling you about the history of the Twin Towers. They're telling you about how they were built. They're telling you the construction that went into it. They're telling you what was there and the skyline, how it affected the New York skyline. And the book ends with the Twin Towers still standing. What is your assumption on when that book was written? Any guesses? Yeah, before 2001, before 9/11. Because it doesn't mention anything about that, right? And so you would think if a book was about the history of the World Trade Center, that they would include 9/11. And the fact that it doesn't means it happened before that, right? And some people try to say, well, that just means that, they'll try to say in the Bible, well, silence doesn't mean that it was earlier. But you're talking about 3,000 people died in these towers. And a book about the Twin Towers is not going to mention that Muslim terrorists blew up the towers and that 3,000 people died. Yet, the destruction of the Jewish Holy Temple was greater than that by many magnitudes, right? And it was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans, the greatest war ever between the Jews and the Romans, right? Their most holiest place where they did animal sacrifices, where they kept their religion, and you're telling me that none of the manuscripts mention the destruction of the Jewish temple, right? It's obvious it's written before the destruction even happened. In addition to that, Jesus predicted that the temple would be destroyed. So you're telling me that Jesus predicted it, they wrote about that, but then nobody writes about the destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 AD? And this is why scholars strongly believe that if not all, the New Testament documents were written prior to 70 AD for the fact alone that it's not even mentioned, or that Jesus predicted it, and then it's not even mentioned. All right. How about this one? Martin Luther King Jr. You find a biography book, right? It talks about Martin Luther King Jr. He was an American Baptist minister and activist, became the most visible spokesman leader in the American civil rights movement from 1995. And it talks about all the work he did for the civil rights movement, and then it ends not mentioning his assassination, right? You would come to the obvious conclusion it was written before 1968, the year that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, or at least written that year before it was became news, right? And so, with the same type of logic, we believe that many of the New Testament books were written prior to 62 AD, 30 years after the death of Jesus. And why is this? Luke was a doctor. He traveled with Paul. He was meticulous. He recorded everything, large details, small details, water depth, in his two books, Luke and Acts, Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. He followed the life of Jesus, followed Paul around, followed Jesus in the events. He reported back everything to a man named Theophilus in both of the books. Doesn't mention Paul was executed by Roman Nero in 68, the guy he followed around. Doesn't mention that at all, right? Doesn't mention that the same group who killed Jesus also killed Jesus' brother James, leader of the church, in 62 AD. But yet he records two Christian martyrs, Stephen and James, who's the brother of John. Right? That's just nonsense to think that those things happened and Luke didn't bother to record any of those things. All right, so scholars are confident that many of the New Testaments were written prior to 62 AD, because Acts had to be written prior to 62 AD, right, before 68, because when Paul died. And then he mentions and before 62, because he doesn't mention these deaths. And then in Acts, Luke says, in my former book, Theophilus, referencing Luke, so Luke had to be written in before that. And then Luke mentions even an earlier book, which means they had to be written even before that, right? Acts and Gospel of Luke. So Acts was written in 62, the latest. Gospel of Luke was written before that, so maybe scholars think maybe around 60 AD or before, because again, in Acts he references his previous book, and Luke references even earlier books that they think is likely Mark, so those had to be written even earlier. And the Dead Sea Scrolls show a date range from 50 AD to 70 AD for the scrolls that were found there. It actually goes older to like 50 BC for other scrolls, but for the New Testament ones, it's like 50 to 70 AD. So we're talking about like, you know, we're looking at like 20 years after the death of Jesus, you know, in there. Some New Testament books written in 40 to 50 AD, a few years after the death of Jesus, right? Paul references 14 eyewitnesses and a group of 500 eyewitnesses, right? He's talking about what happened. He's talking about the resurrection. He's talking about Jesus, and he references people that are still alive. He's referencing a group of 500 people that you can. He says you can still go talk to these guys. William Lilly, a biblical scholar, says, what gives special authority to the list as historical evidence is a reference to the most of the 500 brethren being still alive. Right? Paul, in effect, is saying, "Go ask them." Right? Such a statement is admittedly genuine in a genuine letter written within 30 years of the event, is almost as strong evidence as one could hope for to get something that happened nearly 2,000 years ago. Right? Paul's writing with his authority and respect to these people, and he's listing people that are still alive, their names, and he's saying, "Go ask them." Right? If they're still alive, and he says, "Go ask them," he will lose all credibility. Right? So he's saying, "Don't believe me, go ask them." That means they're still within the events and within the time frame of the events that happened. Here's just a quick timeline, going left to right, just to lay it out a little bit differently. But death of Jesus, right about 38-5 AD, 30-35 AD. Then you have the destruction of the temple on the far right, 70 AD. And then you have the Paul's death in 68 AD. So that means Romans, 2 Corinthians, Galatians all have to be written prior to that, right? Because Paul was dead in 68, right? And then Acts had to be written before that. And Mark, they're thinking even earlier than 50 AD. Right, so we have early copies of stories, we have events, we have historical references, all written within the time frame of when they actually happened, right? As close to the time frame as possible. Is this enough to make the New Testament true, right? No, not yet, because we need eyewitnesses, right? We need more than this, right? We need more than just knowing that they were close to the events. So, does it contain eyewitness elements? Right? If you go through the New Testament, you find it everywhere. Phrases as "we are witnesses," recording what was said, descriptions of what they did. Luke mentions he interviewed eyewitnesses. Peter, Paul, and John claim to be eyewitnesses. Right? Historians, when they validate ancient manuscripts, they're looking for manuscripts that have eyewitness accounts. Right? Luke and the writer of Hebrews claim to have been informed by eyewitnesses. Right? These events were not done in a corner; they were common knowledge. Paul lists, again, 14 people's names the readers could check with, along with another 500. There's 4 women named in the Gospels that were eyewitnesses, right? And not only do they say they were eyewitnesses, but that everyone knows what they were saying to be true. They're speaking to powerful people. Paul's speaking to King Agrippa, and Paul tells the king, "You know what I'm saying to be true, right? So why don't you become a Christian?" Right? And it's not, and he's basically not threatening, what's the word? He's putting his foot down to the king. And he's just saying, "You know what I'm saying is true." Because everyone knew, right? It wasn't done in a corner. Everyone knew what was going on. Were there really eyewitnesses? Right? So what's some more information we can use to kind of back some of this up? So classical scholar and historian Colin Hemmer identifies 84 facts in the last 16 chapters of Acts alone that are confirmed by historical and archaeological research. Right? 84 facts just in the last 16 chapters alone. Imagine that somebody wrote about your hometown when you were small, and they wrote about your hometown, the unique laws, the local weather patterns, local slang for roads and buildings, wrote about the unique topology in your hometown, and the geography, wrote about statues or sculptures that were there, wrote about the water depth of your hometown if you were in a town harbor, and a bunch of unique properties of your hometown for the year that you lived there. And then the author says he claimed to have been there or gotten information from people who had been there in that year. Would you not think you would not know? Would you think he's telling the truth? Of course, you would know he's telling the truth. All right, and yet Luke does the same thing in the Gospel of Luke and in Acts. Right, he goes over these minor and small details that nobody would care about that historians are able to prove to be true. I don't have all 84 here. I just pulled some of them along. But the proper port along the direct destination of a ship crossing from Cyprus, the correct order of approach to Derbe from Lystra from the Cillian gates, the proper association of Thyatira as the center of dying. He goes through all these meticulous details that nobody would know unless they were there. The danger of the coastal trip in this location, the correct sequence of places, right? And so historians were able to go back verse by verse, just in the last 16 chapters alone, and validate at least 84 facts in Acts alone. Right? Acts is according to historians, is a historic, accurately written document, along with the Gospel of Luke. Roman historian Sharon White says, for Acts, the confirmation of historicity is overwhelming. Any attempt to reject its basic historicity must now appear absurd. Roman historians have long taken it for granted. Archaeologist William Ramsey, he was against Acts being true. He said, I began with a mind unfavorable to Acts, but more recently I found myself often brought into contact with the book of Acts as an authority for topography, antiquities, and the society of Asia Minor. It was gradually borne in upon me that the various details the narrative showed marvelous truth. Right? Historians use the book of Acts. Archaeologists use the book of Acts. Gospel of Luke. Luke mentions in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. And then he goes and mentions a bunch of other people that are still alive. Pontius Pilate, Herod, brother of Philip. He goes into to Caiaphas, the high priest. He mentions all these people that are still alive at the time, right? And it'd be like saying in the year 2021 with President Biden, and he names all his cabinet members, right? We would know, okay, we know when he's talking about. Luke's basically doing the same thing, right? Who's reigning? Who are the people in charge that are all alive at the same time? So we know what date he was talking about. The exact date was AD 29, because the 15th year of reign of Tiberius Caesar is AD 29. He gives real names of people in history at the time while they're still alive, has 59 historically confirmed and eyewitness details. Just in the Gospel of Luke, they're able to confirm 59 historically confirmed details. The New Testament documents cite more than 30 people confirmed by secular sources or archaeology. It's not a once-upon-a-time story, right? It is a historically accurate document, manuscript. So here's where secular historians have a problem. Luke's writing about all these historical events, matter of fact, details, minor details, big details, and they're all proven to be true. Yet, mixed in with Acts is 35 recorded miracles. Right? Paul temporarily blinded a sorcerer, cured a man who was crippled from birth, exorcised an evil spirit from a possessed girl, raised a man from the dead who died after falling out a window, healed Publius, father of dysentery, and many more. Right? Why would Luke be so accurate with the trivial details like the erections, water depths, right, particular town names, and then not be accurate at all to important events like miracles, right? And the fact that he's proven to be so accurate with all the trivial details, but then he's lying about the miracles. It takes more faith to believe that he's lying about the miracles than it does just to believe that they're miracles. We know miracles are possible. We know God created the universe, and he tells it in the same even tone with the rest of the information. Right? There's no embellishment. It's just a matter of fact. He's just stating the information. Right. We have Archaeological evidence, I only have 2 to show you here tonight. There's like over 100 biblical archaeological references. I remember like a long time ago, people used to not think, I used to hear about stories where people didn't even think Pontius Pilate was ever real. Oh, he's just a figure of speech. He was just he just represented the government. And then they found letters from Pontius Pilate, his soldiers, right? A tablet here. It says Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, 26 to 37 AD, discovered in 1961. Right? The ossuary of Joseph Caiaphas, the high priest, 18 to 36 AD. Ossuary is where they would dig you back up and then put your bones in this box because they wanted to keep your bones together for the second resurrection. But they found his ossuary, discovered in 1990. Right? The Bible there's a ton of archaeological evidence to back up that it's based on historical information. Jeffrey Schuler is from the U.S. News and World Report, says, in extraordinary ways, modern archaeology has affirmed the historical core of the Old and New Testaments, corroborating key points of the stories of Israel's patriarchs. In the Exodus, all right, so we're talking about Old Testament, the Davidic monarchy, and the life of time and times of Jesus. Basically, archaeology has proven the Bible across the Old Testament and through the New Testament. The Rose Book of Charts, if you're ever interested, has a top 100 archaeological discoveries that you can look through and see some of those. Do you know where archaeologists go to find information to dig something up? They use the Bible. It's a secret in the archaeology community. If you want to look at history, go to the Bible, because everything that they find in the Bible happens to be true, and where they actually find stuff. Bob Cornuke, I went with him on an Israel trip 6 years ago. He was with me in my group. He's an ex-detective, and he's like kind of like the Indiana Jones of modern times, archaeologist. And uses the Bible to find things, and he went through the chapters of where I think Paul is on the boat on the way to Rome, and the Bible talks about different currents crossing each other, and they crash. The boat crashes, and Paul ends up on the island, and then he meets those people. And if you guys remember that story. So he went through those verses, and what's interesting, if you go over to in the Mediterranean, there's an island there, and there's a church up in like the northeast quadrant. There's a church there, a Catholic church. It's like, it's the church of Paul, where the ship crashed and everything, and they kind of like venerate that spot as the spot that Paul shipwrecked. But digging through his research and reading the Bible and what it says about the crossing of the streams and such, and the way, because I think in the Bible it mentions like there's a cross stream. It's a very particular body of water. So he went and did the research, and he found something that mirrored what the Bible said in the southeast corner of the island. And so they went down to in the water digging, and they found an anchor and boat pieces from a boat that would be the same type of boat that Paul would have rowed on, right? Just by looking where the Bible said to go look, right? And it's pretty amazing. So, is this enough to tell the New Testament documents are telling the truth? And I would say, not yet. We even have more. But that's for next session. So, now you have to come for part 2. So that kind of covers, right, the part of the New Testament reliability. Do we have accurate copies of the Old Testament? Yes. Are they historically accurate? We believe so, and we have evidence to show they're historically accurate. Do they tell the truth? Right? That's what we're diving into next. So we know they're historically accurate, and now next we'll talk about the writers themselves, right? The embarrassing stories, the excruciating stories, extra biblical supporting documents to show why we believe New Testament to be true. A lot of the material, again, is from the book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Definitely recommend getting it. If you want to do a deeper dive into a little heavy reading, you have The Resurrection of Jesus, which is a really thick book. It's like this big, right? And The Historical Reliability of the New Testament, also like this thick. But, right, they have a lot of content and stuff you can reference there. I highly recommend the Cross-Examine YouTube channel and Dr. William Craig's videos on his YouTube channel, and then the Calvary 813 channel. You can go back and see the previous sessions. And that's it. So we now open up for questions, comments, discussion points. I will try to repeat any questions. If I'm familiar with it, I'll try to answer best as I can. If it's not an area I've studied before or looked into enough, I'll have to save it for next time and look into it for next time. Thank you. Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, do we have current physical copies within the 25 years, or within 100 AD? Yeah, so what they have is they have from full copies, like I think like Dead Sea Scrolls is like the Almost Book of Isaiah, to fragments of copies. There's a lot of fragments. So even if you go to that website I mentioned, the CS Center of New Testament Study of Manuscripts or whatever it was. But if you go to their site, you'll find that what they have is fragments. For example, they found a fragment that matches copies for Mark. But it's just a fragment. And so while they don't have the whole copy from that year, just having that fragment alone from dating back to prior to 50 AD proves that it was written even closer to the events of Jesus. We have a fragment that's like an earlier Mark fragment. So we don't have full copies of all the ones that were found. So we'll find fragments here, fragments there. Sometimes we find full copies, but with all the fragments and all the quotes and all the copies, we can easily reconstruct the original, and then it's just a matter of, okay, we know what the original said. Now what's the earliest fragment we can find to show that it was written close to the events that happened? I'm not sure if that makes sense. No, the Mark fragment that was really actually discovered in like back in 2013, 2014. So they've even found more since then. But that was like when they found that, they were like, this is even earlier than everything else we have. And then what's kind of interesting, I think they probably changed their viewpoint now. Some of the secular scholars will try to deny, well, it's not Mark. But they can't find anything else that matches except for Mark. Right, and so it's more of a wanting to, I guess, when you're inserting your biases into it, where you don't want it to be true. Yeah, and then you have the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? But that was found. So they even have manuscripts from. They found manuscripts since 2013. The answer is yes. I always thought the Dead Sea Scrolls were Old Testament. They're both New and Old. Yep, New Testament too. So the question was, the Dead Sea Scrolls contain Old, New Testament, but it was Old and New. They have both types of documents in there. But the biggest one in the Dead Sea Scrolls is probably I think Isaiah, because it's like the whole book. Everything else is like fragments of things. So the Dead Sea Scrolls dates between like 50 BC to I want to say I can't remember, it was like 70 AD. There's a range for all the scrolls, but I think it goes back to like 50 BC or something like that. How do we know the New Testament is not just a historical fiction? Like the historical details are correct, but the miracles are not. So that comes down to beyond a reasonable doubt, right? That becomes down to, for example, Luke, Acts, Gospel of Luke, Book of Acts. He's got 84 historical confirmed details in one book, just in 16 of the last chapters. He's got 54 historically confirmed details in the other. It's a matter of fact. He says it. He basically just says it with no, basically just a matter of fact, right? No embellishment at all. And he mentions the miracles in there. So it takes, based on that evidence alone, it doesn't make sense that he's making up the miracles in between, right? It takes almost more faith to believe that he made up the miracles, even though all the historical information is correct. And it takes more faith to kind of believe that than it does to realize the miracles must have happened. But you have to realize that what you're building that belief on is that God created the universe, right? The miracles are possible. We already talked about that in the last session. So the fact we know miracles are possible, right? If God created the universe, we know that God can cause miracles, then Luke writing about miracles is not really a big deal. Right? It's not even an issue, right? They're historic. You're talking about a historically accurate document, and he's talking about the miracles that happened as well. And they're eyewitnesses to those miracles. Even the Jesus' resurrection, people are alive at the time that Paul mentions. Jesus is alive, resurrected, go talk to these people, and the other 500 witnesses that are mentioned. And it's the best explanation than you can come up with. It's the only explanation that fits all the conditions, right? People have tried to dissuade, well, the resurrection can't be true because, we'll talk more about this in later sessions, but it's like, can't be true because of something. They'll come up with, they stole the body, that he never really got crucified, and when you look at the evidence, all those arguments fall apart, basically. Right? And you even have, like if your mom says you're brave, maybe she might be true, right? Maybe you're probably brave. And so you find evidence from people that are against Christianity even saying, backing up the facts of Luke and things like that. So that's what makes it even more compelling. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but hopefully it does. We have 5,700 Greek copies around how old? So I'm not sure I would say, so this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier. The other 5,700 Greek copies, they believe that most of them, if not all of them, were written prior to 62 AD. Right? But again, it comes down to what's reasonable doubt, in the sense of not mentioning the destruction of the Jewish temple was in 70 AD. So Paul died in 68 AD, and the death of Jesus' brother, was in 62 AD. So that's why they think they were all written prior to 62, because nobody mentions any of those things. But it could be they're off and they're wrong by some years. It could be that maybe some were written after one of those events, but before the fall of the temple. So it's kind of like you have to apply what makes sense, that they don't mention these things at all. Right? No, not all the copies are that old. Right now. Yeah, they find copies in the hundreds and 200s. So the other question comes up usually is, what about those other books of the Bible? I think I had a slide for this, but I think I hit it. What about, let me bring up my slide real quick. What about other books in the Bible that are not added, right? So people say, what about the Gospel of Peter? What about the Gospel of Judas and the Gospel of Thomas? How come those are included? Why aren't those part of the Bible? Because you have to realize those copies were found 150 years later, right? So think about it, if you're trying to get a message to a bunch of Christians and you want to convince them of something, right? You just put one of the disciples' names on it, and then you send it out. Everyone buy my new ice cream flavor. It's the best ever, says Peter. And then whatever it is, you send it out to everybody. But it's written 150 years later, right? So obviously the disciples were dead at that point, right? And so that's why the church didn't include, when the Council of Nicaea and the Council of Constantinople, when they got together in the 300s, they only included books that were written by one of the eyewitnesses, disciples of the eyewitness, someone who was an eyewitness or someone who interviewed an eyewitness, right? They only included books that were written in the 1st century, right? So any books written like long after were not included, and they had to be consistent and not contradictory to the rest of the Bible terms. So that's why these books of Gospel of Judas, it was written 150 years later, way past the original event, and that's where the Da Vinci Code, if you watch the Da Vinci Code, it misinforms people because it's talking about these other Gospels, and people not realizing those Gospels are written like hundreds of years later, right? They're not true, doctrine and true books of the Bible. Yeah. That's right. Yeah, so the statement was made that those later books had a lot of fanciful accounts and had like all these extra tricks that Jesus supposedly did that don't. You're right, that when Jesus did the things he did it with a purpose. And those ones kind of don't focus on that purpose. All right. Yeah, we'll be talking, that's probably like I think that's like the thing that wraps it all up in the end, is like, so what we're trying to show here is that, unlike other religious books, the Bible or Christianity, the New Testament is the only one that's so historically accurate, and there's so much evidence for why it's true, and we'll go into a lot of that. So then it's the resurrection historically lines up to be true because everything else is true around it. And then we don't talk about the Old Testament for a reason, because if you prove the New Testament to be true, you get the Old Testament for free, because Jesus references the Old Testament, because they reference the Old Testament. So you don't even have to while you can still validate the Old Testament to be historically accurate, a lot of parts, the fact that the New Testament, Jesus even mentions the Old Testament. So you prove the New Testament true, you get the Old Testament thrown in with it. Yeah. And that's it. Thank you guys very much. And we'll see you next